Hello and welcome to our Parsha class together for Parshat Vayishlach. I've been thinking a lot about what we spoke about last week, which it's not necessary to have heard it if you were not here, although I think everyone here was present, about Yaakov and being deceitful and sort of that what like goes around, comes around kind of perspective. Someone pointed out to me that really the person who was deceitful was Rivka, and Yaakov is sort of more parallel to Leah in that they were both the children and the pawns in a larger game orchestrated by their parents, which I thought was interesting. I think it might explain why Leah and Yaakov were never quite comfortable with each other, because they both saw the pawn in the opposite, in their Kenegdo, in that relationship. And so I was thinking more about Rivka, and I feel like I've mentioned many times over the last few weeks this idea that I had heard that Yaakov wasn't able to go bury Rivka, that she died alone. And so I thought we would look at Rivka, think about her, and I feel like I hope it's okay that this has been real sort of gritty Torah. Last year, we talked about the beautiful qualities of our Avot and our Imahot, and I feel like this year I've been dwelling in a more realistic place of complicated behaviors and human characteristics. And for me, I feel like there's something very accessible about that. But I also, I hope it's for me, it's inspiring because it feels more accessible. So hopefully everyone is coming along that journey with me. Next week, I think we will switch to something else. I will push us out of this lens and into some other topic. But for today, I wanted to look at that midrash. I think that it is haunting. It's haunting me. Joey and I were talking about dreams today, so I'm trying to bring it into the light and share it with everyone here. So I'm going to share my screen so everyone's on the same page. This is also, I think, I might have brought it anyway because it's one of those fascinating places where we see midrash at work, in my opinion. So we have this one pasuk, it's towards the end of our parsha, where it tells us v'tamat Devora meineket Rivka, that Devora, Rebecca's nursemaid, died. V'tivaker mitachat lebeit El tachat ha'alon, and she was buried under a tree at Bethel. V'ikra shmo Alon Bachut, and so they called it Alon Bachut, the tree of cryings. And it's sort of a throwaway pasuk, one might say, right? No pasuk is destined to be thrown away, but it's one of those ones where you sort of wonder, what is this adding? We've never heard about Devorah before, so it's notable to mention her death, but it feels sort of out of context. And that's it, right? She dies, they bury her, they rename the place Alon Bachut, and they move on. And so Rashi and the Midrash and many of the commentaries are trying to make sense of what this pasuk is doing here, what Devorah's role is in the story, right, in the plot line, and why she's mentioned here. So there's three Rashis here that I want to look at. I put them all sort of in the same place, and I tried to separate them with paragraphs. So the first Rashi is explaining who Devorah is, right? That feels important. Ma'yan Devorah v'beit Yaakov, how is she related to the house of Yaakov? Ela lefisha amra Rivka leYaakov v'shalachti v'lakachti misham. Shalcha Devorah etzlo lepadan Aram litzeit misham. So Rashi is remembering that back in last week's parsha, when Rivka tells Yaakov to run away because Esav is coming to kill him, she says, "I will send for you and fetch you from there." Right, once Esav's anger sort of dies down, which she assumes it will sort of become diffuse, so then she'll send for Yaakov and he can come back. And so this Devorah is being sent to Padan Aram to tell him to leave from there, right? So that's interesting to me, hopefully to you, right? That it seems like somehow Rivka understood that Esav's anger had dwindled. And we actually see that in the face-to-face meeting that Yaakov and Esav have in this week's parsha, and so she had sent her nursemaid to come and get Yaakov so he could come home, so they could have a beautiful mother-child reunion. But sadly, right, v'meita b'derech, Devorah dies on the way. Midivrei Rabbi Moshe hadarshan l'tiha, right? Interestingly, Rashi explains where he heard this from the comment of Rabbi Moshe hadarshan. So Devorah is connected to Rivka. She's being sent by Rivka to collect Yaakov. It's safe to come home. So that I think makes it an interesting story already. It gives some color to this woman, Devorah, why she suddenly has intruded upon the storyline. But then Rashi adds the second piece, this piece of that the Agadah nitbasher sham be'evel sheni shehugad lo al imo shemita. So Breshit Rabbah gives the news that there was a second morning, right? There's a question, why is it called alon bachut and not like alon bechi, right? The tree of crying. It's the tree of cryings because also Rivka died. So now I would say it feels to me like they buried the lead, right? God, right? The Torah buried the lead. Rivka, one of our imahot, died, and instead we learn about her nursemaid, Devorah, dying. And Rashi is saying we didn't really hear about Rivka's dying. So it seems like Rashi at least feels compelled to explain, why is Rivka's death not mentioned here? That feels like the death that is worth describing here, especially in relation to Yaakov. We don't know if Yaakov had a relationship with Devorah, but presumably not a significant one. So Rashi's explanation is et yom mota, right? That they hid the day of Rivka's death. Shelo yikalalu habriot, keres sheyatsa mimenu Esav, so that we don't curse her, saying from her womb came Esav. Af hakatuv lo firsama. And so therefore, the scripture also didn't publicize her death. So the they seems to be someone related to Rivka who lives in Canaan with her, that they didn't publicize her death. And so the Torah is sort of reflecting that. So that felt to me like a little bit harsh, right? It's not just her womb, like it took two to make Yaakov and Esav, right? It also goes back to that midrashic tendency to totally demonize Esav, right? Whereas I'm not sure that that's like a totally fair thing. So it either feels like they should also not mention Yitzchak's death, which of course Yitzchak's death is mentioned, and interestingly, it even tells us that Esav and Yaakov came to bury him together. Right? Just like Yishmael and Yitzchak came to bury Abraham, the two brothers who have a hard rift between them come back together to bury their father. And it feels like if Yitzchak's death is mentioned, then the fact that it's from her womb that came Esav feels like a little unfair. And again, Esav maybe is not worthy of, we wouldn't curse her so much for that. So Rashi answers some questions, but I think opens the door to other questions, right? So he answers who Devorah is, and he gives this interesting sub-story about why Yaakov is sad, right? Because otherwise, also, like, it's very kind of Yaakov to cry over Devorah, like to have some kind of mourning for her, but it's not clear why he would really mourn her deeply. But it's really Rivka that he's mourning. But then the question of why Rivka's death isn't mentioned, to me, feels a little bit unanswered. And so here, I think that we have to look at Breshit, back when Rivka's sending Yaakov away, and also the Rambam, who clearly has a machloket with Rashi here. Right, so the pasuk here says, "Vatomer lo ima," that imo, that Yaakov's mother Rivka says to him, "Alai kilalatcha beni," that your klala, your curse, will be upon me, my son. Right, ach shema b'koli, just do as I say. So right, there's a moment where Yaakov says, "Wait, are you sure we should do this plot where I dress up like Yaakov and like Esav, and trick Yitzchak into giving me the bracha?" And she says, "Don't worry, I'll take the sin." Right? There's probably some of us, probably myself, can think of a time where I say, like, "I'll take the blame. Let's just do it." Right? She thinks she knows what's right. She's trying to rush along the plot line to get Yaakov to do what he's supposed to do. And she says, "Don't worry, your curse will be upon me." And so the Rambam, right, the Rambam points out, I jumped the gun. I should have said it in the Rambam's name, right? That Yitzchak also would have deserved that curse, and he doesn't get it because his sons bury him together. And so the Rambam is not comfortable with this. These sources are backwards. I apologize. And so we have to look somewhere else. And I think that what I feel like becomes clear from this Tanhuma that we'll look at in a second, is that it's more simple than there being some kind of like karma about her having Esav. The punishment is sort of what fits the crime on some level, which is to say that Rivka dies alone because she created a mess in which she had to send everyone away from her. Right. So it's not some kind of like special divine bolt of lightning. It's actually what happens to real complicated people when they do real complicated things. Right. So the Tanhuma says that maybe the reason we don't mention her is that it's possible that there was no one who was there kavod b'mitata to give her honor when she died. Right? Ki Yaakov in Enusham, right? We know she sent Yaakov away. Again, I think that's like one of those really deep sadnesses of these prakim, is that the son that loved her had to get sent away because of her actions and was not there for her. The Esav soneota, right? And because of her actions, Esav actually hates her. And he doesn't come, shama. He doesn't come from where he is to bury his mother, right? Sometimes we do things that are so hard that even in death, we see that, family can't come together over it, right? Esav and Yitzchak could come together to bury, Esav and Yaakov could come together to bury Yitzchak. They're not able, Esav is not able to come back together to bury Rivka, right? Rivka is his mother too, and she orchestrated the plot to take his bracha, and he's not able to come back. Yitzchak is already blind, right? Kaho enav, and he's not able to leave the house. And so therefore she dies alone. And the scripture hakatuv lo rotze hakatuv lahazkir sheyikravuha b'nei chet, right? That the Hittites were the ones to bury her because her husband was an invalid. One son hated her, the one who was able to come home. The other was not able to come home, and she died alone. And that was sad for the Torah. And so the Torah didn't want to call attention to it. I don't know what other people think about that, but for me, that feels like a very sort of real and fair, like just desserts for Rivka. That she made these choices that resulted in this sad thing. It's not some crazy divine punishment. It's reality, right? Sometimes we make a mess we can't get out of, and it's really sad, but it just is what it is. So I was reading in Rabbi Shai Held's book. He wrote a beautiful book called The Heart of Torah. And back in Parshat Chaye Sarah, which is when we first meet Rivka, he wrote an article that's called People Are Complicated. And so I took two paragraphs from within the arc of his essay, right, where we see also the beautiful part of Rivka, right? Because I think that this is about Rivka's spoken and unspoken legacy, right? So her spoken legacy, and this is what I taught on Chaya Sarah last year, is how wonderful Rivka is, right? To remind everyone when Eliezer gets to the well and he constructs this test for the young woman to pass in order to be Yitzchak's husband. Rivka goes above and beyond. She mimics the behavior of Abraham. She runs quickly, just like Abraham runs quickly to serve the Malachim in his tent. She is courteous to his animals, right? She runs to bring him home. She's very bold and brave to go. She says, Eilech, sort of reminiscent of the Lech Lecha of Abraham. There's something very wonderful about her, right? And that's this first paragraph, that when Eliezer plans to ask the young woman for water, but the real measure of her appropriateness for Isaac is whether she offers water to the camels without him prompting. Right. So on one level, of course, this is simply a test of her generosity. She is so kind that she does more than she asked. And beyond her concern for people, she cares also for the needs of her animals. But then Rabbi Held says something that to me was like so obvious once he said it. I did not get there by myself, that I think is amazing. He says, at another level, the servant may understand something critical about traumatized, taciturn Isaac. He is not capable of asking for what he needs. Right. So Yitzchak has suffered this great trauma at the almost Akedah, maybe, which is what we might call it. Right. And he comes home as a trauma survivor. And Eliezer sees that he's not articulate. He's not able to ask for what he wants. And so he sees, using Rabbi Held's words, that a suitable wife for Isaac will not only listen to what he says, but also try and intuit what he cannot say. The servant's test is about compassion, but it is also about sensitivity and discernment, about responding to unspoken needs and yearnings. Right. So first of all, I think that adds a beautiful layer of depth to Chayei Sarah. Maybe we can think about that more next year. But I think that it fleshes out Rivka's character, right? Rivka is not actually Avraham 2.0, right? She's not just the running and the moving, but she also has some sensitivity and discernment, right? Eliezer doesn't say water my camels, but she sees that the camels will need water and she goes to help him. And that is something that makes her a very good match for Yitzchak, right? And when we see that Yitzchak loves her and he brings her into his mother's tent, it feels like Eliezer has done the right thing. He brought home someone who was able to respond to the unspoken needs, the needs that Yitzchak could clearly not articulate. Beautiful. And I don't want to lose that. And I think that is Rivka's spoken legacy. But Rabbi Held reminds us, right, that Rivka does this crazy thing later in her life, right? People are not simple. She's not all good and attention and sensitivity. And what he points out that I think is especially important is that it's two sides of the same coin. Right. So he says she's not, I think he uses the words like she's not an odious villain, right? It's not totally bad what she does. She has mixed, complicated feelings that come up, but he says we are capable of both deep kindness, right, as she showed earlier in her life, and staggering selfishness. Right. I will certainly own that I would like to believe I'm capable of deep kindness, but also know that sometimes I display the other ends of the coin, right? We may be tempted to believe that attunement to other people's vulnerabilities leads ineluctably to care and concern for them. Right? That's what we want. We want a perfect Rivka. We want a Rivka who will be a perfect carer and concerned person for Yitzchak her whole life through all of his choices. But emotional sensitivity is no guarantee of kindness. The ability to understand other people's experiences can elicit generosity, but it can also enable scheming and manipulation, often in the very same person. Right. So what got Rivka the job, what got her to be one of the imahot, to be the mother of Yaakov Avinu and Esav, to be buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, right, also led to a situation where she saw that her husband was blind and she understood how to manipulate him, right? By being sensitive to his strengths and weaknesses, she was able to carry off the plot that landed her in this spot. And so I think there's something very powerful to one quality being both constructive and destructive in one person, right? When we thought about Esav 2 weeks ago, right, that red character could lead to being a shochet or a murderer, right, or a surgeon or a murderer, that you can channel your strong feelings, right? So when Rivka is able to channel that emotional sensitivity into kindness, she behaves as one of our imahot. When she is not able to, when she lets it enable her scheming and manipulation, it landed her in this spot where she ended up dying alone and without being mentioned in the Torah and without Yaakov being with her. And again, I think that is, I think what I like about it is it feels like that's just reality. That's what a sad thing, we might say, right? How unfortunate for Rivka that that's where she landed. And I think that there's something deeply sad for Yaakov, that just as I started to realize over the week that I was saying Yaakov was the manipulator, when in fact, I think maybe Rivka is the manipulator, right? It seems like Yaakov is also getting punished here for his mother's death, being alone, right? Because presumably he loved his mother. He cries for her at this tree. He wanted to be there at her end. And so, right, sometimes our behavior punishes not only ourselves, but also those that we care about. And so I want to finish by looking at this, I think, exceedingly beautiful Shnei Luchot Habrit, which wonders where, right, he talks about why the tree is named Alon Bachut instead of Bechia, which would have been only about weeping about Devorah. And in this, he asks a question about the verses that come after this first verse, right? So they're on the road back home. We learn that Devorah dies and they bury her. And then immediately God speaks to Yaakov and gives a very similar covenantal bracha to the one that he's already given Yaakov back in last week's Parsha when he runs away. And so the Shnei Luchot HaBrit connects those two pieces, those two passages. And in a part that I didn't bring you, he says, well, why did God show himself to Yaakov now? Usually God doesn't show them God's self to someone who's in mourning. But he brings many of the reasons we talked about, that Rivka was either being punished for birthing Esav, or maybe for just the sadness of being buried alone. And he says, in view of these commentaries, we must understand the vision that Yaakov had at that time as a visit by God to Yaakov in his capacity as a mourner. God simply visited him to console him, Yaakov, over the loss of his mother Rivka. It was a birkat avelim, baruch hu. And I thought that was so beautiful, that even if Rivka somehow sort of made her bed to die alone, Yaakov hadn't done that. And so God saw Yaakov alone and came to give him a shiva call, which I thought was such a beautiful way of trying to remedy an extreme misfortune sort of done upon him, right? I think that this week's Parsha maybe gave me some compassion thinking back on Yaakov last week, to say a lot of the things that Yaakov did were sort of brought upon him by Rivka's scheming. And we can understand Rivka to just be a complicated character, the way that Rabbi Held sort of helps us understand her. But at the end of the day, even if it's sad for Rivka, it's certainly more sad for Yaakov, I think, to be alone. And so I thought that idea that God comes to console Yaakov was maybe like a nod. I understood the divine action to be a nod towards the complicated nature of life, right? Maybe Rivka sort of had to be alone. That was what she brought upon herself. But Yaakov, you don't have to be alone. I'll come and visit you, was sort of how I was thinking about God in that moment. So I don't know. I welcome thoughts, questions, comments. This has certainly been like a journey. Thank you for coming along on it with me to think about all these characters and their real complicated behaviors. But for me, it helped sort of close that portion of our class to think about Rivka and her realness as well.
I had heard that Esav had married two women. They were both Hittites.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously his mother, Rivka, saw that and saw that he would not be good as a leader of the Jewish people, so maybe that was why she came up with that plan.
Yes, definitely. I think so, right? And she even says to Yitzchak, like, look at what happened. Your son married two people that you expressly told him not to marry, right? Local women as opposed to women from back home. And I think that to me, that makes it even more real, right? There's this idea that like she had good intentions. She wasn't trying to like just manipulate for the sake of manipulation. But, I wonder what would have happened had she talked to Yitzchak about it and said, Yitzchak, hey, maybe like Esav's not the right one to get the covenantal bracha. And then maybe Yitzchak would have said, yeah, I know that. I'm going to give it to Yaakov, right? And then like everything then she would have died with all of her family surrounding her. And Esav might have been annoyed, right? We're always annoyed when we feel passed over, but it wouldn't have been in this manipulative, harmful way.
Was Rivka buried in Hebron also? Is that true?
Is.
She is. Oh, okay.
Yes, we learn that in Parshat Vayishlach for sure. There might be another place where it says Yaakov is telling his children, that's where Abraham and Sarah are buried. That's where Yitzchak and Rivka are buried. That's where I buried Leah. You have to bury me there too. So we know, that the Torah tells us that she's buried there, but it doesn't tell us at the moment of her death.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's, that I think when you started to say that Esav's wives were Hittites, I thought, maybe Esav's people, right? I'm a daughter-in-law. Some other people here might have in-laws. Maybe like Esav's wives saw that Esav was not coming and they were embarrassed, and they were the Hittites that buried her. I don't know.
That's right. Yeah, her daughter.
An interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
further sort of adding to that complicated life reality.
Mhm.
Yael,
Yes.
something always kind of troubles me about blaming Esau for marrying local women,
Hmm.
because at that time, young people didn't go out and choose a mate and marry them. Parents were involved.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to assume that when he married these women, his parents allowed it, or even, you hear what I'm saying? He didn't
Yeah.
go out and get married on his own. That he wasn't a 21st century person.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's a disconnect there. I don't understand the blame if his parents perhaps facilitated it. They certainly didn't object.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tamara, right? Meaning, like, what happened at that moment? Did Yitzchak and Rivka say, oh, well, let's let Esav do what he wants? Because, I am convinced that Yitzchak didn't ever intend to give Esav the covenantal bracha. I think we talked about it a little one of these weeks, right? That Rabbi Sachs wrote a beautiful article about this, that the bracha that Yitzchak gives, the one that he thinks is Esav, is not the bracha he gives Yaakov when he knows he is Yaakov. Meaning it's not the covenantal bracha. That comes only when he knows Yaakov is in front of him. And so Rabbi Sachs sort of argues that Yitzchak's most beautiful trait is that he's able to love unconditionally. And so he knows that Esav is not the covenantal child, but he loves him anyway. He gives him this bracha of sort of bounty and power and control over the lands, but not the eretz and zera, the land and progeny piece of it. And so I wonder if Yitzchak was like, fine, marry a local person because you're not going to be the one to continue the covenantal legacy, right? Maybe he didn't care. And Rivka misunderstood that and used that as like further ammo, right? Presumably Rivka wasn't really in charge of the marriage, just Yitzchak was. I don't know. Again, it's certainly, it's a family that does not talk to each other. And I think that creates a lot of difficulty.
Mhm. Mhm.
On a very light note, and really this is said in jest, the situation that I just mentioned about the parents certainly must have allowed, if not facilitated. It reminds me of a relative of ours, very Haredi family. And she had several married children. And she told us once, after a particular marriage, she said, no more Hungarians.
Oy vey.
More Hittites, you know.
Yeah. Well, and especially, that it was something, I guess, like that's why I've heard it here and now, and I heard it in Anna's comment. I think it's striking that the Midrash assumes the Hittites take it upon themselves to bury Rivka and to bury her in the Ma'ara next to her, her family plot. That seems like an extraordinary kindness to me. And I'm not sure why it was like assumed that would be done if she had no one.
And why couldn't Yitzhak go? I mean, okay, he couldn't see well, but he still could go. I mean, someone could have assisted him. I don't understand that.
So I think that the Midrash is assuming that Yitzchak is also unhappy with Rivka. So he's not able to see, and maybe he's not willing to arrange even her burial. I don't know. It's a good question.
Rashi has no comment on that?
No. Again, because Rashi would have to he would have to bring it somewhere else to comment on the Midrash because it doesn't even say it in the text.
We assume.
Right.
That.
Are you going to say something, Avery?
Well, I mean, I think this clan is highly respected in the Hittite community. Abraham was at the gates with the leaders of the community and buying the plot and so on. So I think it's possible that, given that Isaac was blind, that the women, I like the idea that it was the women who chipped in this way.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? They're not really strangers, and she's not really all alone, right? She belongs to a clan that is greatly respected in that community. And in some ways that's a nice thing, right? That's like, that feels to me like a slight moderation of this dying, all by yourself situation.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, and to think about Yitzhak and Rivka's relationship, right? It says when Rivka and Yitzhak when they meet, that Rivka falls off her camel. And I think it's the Netziv says that that's like a sign that she was very much in awe of her husband.
Mm.
And I read somewhere that, right, like Rivka wanted to come into this family, right? Elech, she said, like, I'll go, I'll do it. And so like she gets this beautiful thing. She marries into this very special family. And it says that Yitzhak loves her, right? He's the first one to express that love, right? Abraham doesn't say that he loves Sarah. They have children together, they have this journey together, but right off the bat, it says that Yitzchak loved her. And so you wonder what happens, right? And then in the beginning of Toldot, it says Vayater, that he pleads on her behalf, right? He clearly has like a very strong relationship with Rivka. In fact, right, instead, he does not go looking for a concubine, unlike his father and his son, right? He says, I want Rivka, right? I want her to be the mother of my children. Please, God, intercede on her behalf. So there is like a very strong and powerful bond there. And you have to wonder, right? Had Rivka not orchestrated this manipulation, would he have come out of his house blind to bury her, right? Would there have been great mourning and wailing for her? It's sort of, that would fit in like the arc of their love story. But I think that this act of Rivka's, being able to see Yitzchak's blind spots, figuratively and literally, and manipulate them, caused a pretty irreparable rift, perhaps, between the two. And they lived together, presumably. I don't, tents were obviously, it's not like a two-person Coleman tent, but it feels like it would be, you can picture that in Torah reading tomorrow on Shabbos. But they lived together. Like, what kind of awkward, family relationship would that have been after Yaakov runs away, right? They're empty nesters. Yaakov runs away, Esav leaves angrily, and they're sort of left to look at each other in this unhappiness. I don't know. Maybe it comes out in the death, right? That he can't go out to bury her. There's such complicated relationships. Many people write extensively about sort of like the day school education, and I am certainly not one to. My husband's not here anymore. He was sitting on the couch, and he is someone who crafts beautiful day school education. But you learn about these sort of two-dimensional or one-dimensional characters that love each other and do the right things, and they're tzaddiks and tzaddikets, and when you sort of like peel back a little bit, it seems like the Midrash really understood that there was a lot more to them than that. And I think that that's part of what has driven me through these 4 weeks together, is like to say, like, look at all this stuff. And it's not like only modern, sort of edgy, on the boundaries of Orthodoxy, right, people. It's the Midrash, right? It's like there was a realization that there was something that was festering, deep inside there.
Our heroes and heroines are not perfect, are they?
Right.
Just
Right. And I think, in some ways, I think it makes them a lot more accessible. Like it feels
humans.
easier to say, I hope that I could have that deep kindness and compassion and discernment of how people are feeling that Rivka has, because it's not all she had, right? So I don't have to only have that to be able to strive for it. I can recognize that sometimes I'm selfish and sometimes I'm compassionate, and I can be like Rivka, because that is also what Rivka was like, right? Or, I could be like Esav. Sometimes I could be really angry, but it's okay, because sometimes that pushes you to be a surgeon, right? And you can use your weak points to also be your strong points, I think is a compelling and beautiful idea. So although it sounds sort of negative, I think it actually is really a positive. And I think to leave us with that image of God coming to console Yaakov is, I think, a very beautiful one, a sort of a recognition that the world is not always perfect in the way we want it to be, but even God, is able to pay a shiva call, and to see that and try to make a difference without, a miracle, right? Okay. Well, if no one has anything else to add, thank you for coming tonight. It's nice to see you, Debbie and Tamar, on a week you're not usually here, right? Didn't I have you last week, Tamar?
Our class didn't, something happened, something went wrong and the Gemara class didn't meet.
Well, I'm sorry you missed it, but it was to my great benefit that I got
Yeah.
to see both of you here.
The benefit was ours.
Yep, thank you.
Wonderful to see all of our nice regulars as well. And I will see you next week.
All
Okay.
right.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
Good night,
you.
everyone. A very early Shabbat Shalom.
Good Shabbos.